What a joy to be here tonight with all of you. Thank the Lord for the privilege of serving Him. It has been an incredible journey. God is faithful. Enjoyed that music so very much. And I see a lot of children here tonight. Could I take a moment to tell them a quick story? Kids, would you do me a favor? Would you mind coming up to this bench? I'm going to tell you one of my favorite all-time stories. Would you mind doing that? Would you feel bad about that? Coming up to the bench here just for a minute, and then you can go back. Or no. Come on up, kids. Come on up here. I want to tell you a real quick story from the Amazon jungles of Peru. So, come on this bench up here and have a seat there, okay? Good to have you guys here tonight, and girls, thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to see all of you. And when we think about the jungles and the Amazon, can you tell me what animal you might think of in the jungles? Monkeys. You hit it right on the nail.
Lions.
What was that?
Cute lions.
Well, lions not in the Amazon jungle. In Africa, yes. And what other animal? Tigers, no. We have jaguar. But let me tell you my favorite story. You see, when my kids were small, one day we were sleeping in an Indian village. Now, they live in bamboo huts, dirt floor. Kids, you sleep on a bamboo bed. It's one big room. And no air conditioning, no TV. Terrible, isn't it? And the kids, though, they played soccer barefoot because they never had shoes. But anyway, we were sleeping in this Indian village trying to get a church started. And one day my son, he was about your age. And he came and he had in his little hands a future tree swinger. And he said, "Dad, please can I have this little woolly monkey?" I looked at those dark, steely eyes. I knew all about woolly monkeys. I said, "Son, you can have it, but you're going to have to take good care of it." So he gave it to his sister. And she raised that monkey, feeding it with a teaspoon of sugared water and milk. Unfortunately, though, the monkey lived. Thought she was a person, tore our house to pieces. Now, when you get home tonight, I want you to look up woolly monkey. You'll see they're the most beautiful of all the monkeys. Beautiful round head, short fur, long arms and legs. They swing through the trees. Smokey, we called her because she was coal black. Lived in the house. We couldn't take it any longer. Smokey outside with you. So she lived under the roof eaves. She ate bugs and spiders and grasshoppers. Anything that moved was edible. But her favorite food of all was my wife's homemade bread rolls. You see, where we live, kids, there were no bakeries, no stores. You could only reach our home by water. There were no roads. We lived deep in the jungle with a native Indian tribe called the Aguaruna Indians. And so to have bread, on Saturday my wife would make these beautiful bread rolls, put them on the table, hot with butter dripping down the side, and Smokey could smell that bread a quarter of a mile away. And there you see Smokey. There she comes across the tree line, swinging arm by arm. She lands on the front porch. She looks through the screen door and she sees that bread sitting there. She wants that bread in the worst way. But she would wait till no one could see her. And then she would pull the door open with her little paw, stick her head in, make sure that no one was watching, slide across the floor on her belly, closing the door quietly with her long tail. And then lickety-split to that table, she'd grab that bread, holding it high in her arm, run to the door, swing the door open, run down that short sidewalk with me right behind her. "Smokey, put that bread back, you crazy monkey." And she'd run down that sidewalk. The sidewalk then ended in a steep hill. She would scurry up that hill where I could not get to her. Then she would turn, sit down, munching the bread, looking at me as if to say, what are you going to do about it? Well, are we smarter than monkeys? What do you think? Yeah. Of course we are. We're smarter than monkeys. So next Saturday, I was ready. The bread was on the table, butter dripping down the side. Smokey could smell that bread. I looked out. Oh, there she comes. I can see her coming across the tree line. Hand over hand, she was making for that bread. I took my belt off, and I hung it on a little wooden bar right at the door. And I thought, Monkey, if you come today, I'm going to give you a good one. I turned my head, acting like I couldn't see her, but I watched her from the corner of my eye. Up to the door she came. She thought I wasn't looking, opened the door with her paw, slid across the floor, closed the door quietly with her tail, and then like a bolt of lightning to that table, she grabbed that bread and was heading for the door. I got there first because I'm smarter than a monkey, right? As she was leaving the door, I pulled that belt back and swatted her on her rump. Have you ever seen a monkey cry? Oh, she stopped in midair. She cried. She scolded me. She fussed at me. She went out the door rubbing her bottom down the sidewalk, turned back and scolded me some more. And I thought, Monkey, you've learned your lesson. Until next Saturday. Bread was on the table, just in case I left my belt there. There she came. I looked, acted like I didn't see her. Up to the door, she made her way. She opened the door up, thought no one could see her, slid across the floor, closed it quietly, and then she ran lickety-split to that table, and I thought, Monkey, you have had it. I'm going to give you one today you'll not forget. Have your mom and dad ever told you that? Yeah. She grabbed that bread. We got to the door at the same time. I reached to grab that belt to give her one she would remember for a long time. Just as her black tail flashed past my hand, grabbed the belt buckle, pulled the belt away from my hand. Out the door she ran, dragging my belt with her tail down the sidewalk, climbed up that steep hill where I could not get to her, and she turned and sat down, munching her bread, looking at me just to say, now what are you going to do about it? Well, I found out I'm not smarter than a monkey. Hey guys, thank you for coming tonight. You can go back and sit down with your folks if you like. Thank you. Well, it's a jungle out there. And what a joy. You know, it was 60 years ago this year that I sat in a service on a Sunday night just like this, our home church in Whittier, California. My wife and I had made application to become Nazarene missionaries several years even before that. And we were waiting to be sent, thinking they would probably send us to Africa. That was kind of the heartbeat of our church in the early 60s. And so that night, a missionary came from Peru, of all places, South America. And he spoke that night about the desperate need of a doctor caring for a group of natives deep in the Amazon jungle that they had visited. And that night, my heart broke, tears splashed down my cheeks. I knew God, without a doubt, was calling me to these unknown people to all places, the Amazon. Do you know how large the Amazon is? The Amazon is so large it would barely fit in the continental United States. From New York to LA, that's how big the Amazon is. One of the most least evangelized places in the world today. You hear so very little about it. But God was faithful, and we accepted that call. I went to the missionary that night and I said, Sir, what you spoke really touched my heart. I think God is calling us to those people. He said, well, I shouldn't tell you this, but I was back in headquarters a couple weeks ago, and they told me they had a young doctor and his wife out in California, but they didn't give me any name, he said, that they're thinking about sending there. And we lived in California. And would you know it, 2 weeks later I came home from work. My wife met me at the door with tears streaming down her cheek, a letter that said, "Dear Dr. and Mrs. Larry Garman, would you accept a rural assignment?" I was raised in rural Ohio. They had a different dictionary. And God confirmed the call. That was 60 years ago. 59 years ago, we went to Mexico for language study. And then, after that year, into the Amazon jungles, and another language on top of it. The Algoruna dialect. 4 nasal vowels, 4 oral vowels. You can get in trouble really quick. Kids, you want to count with me? You guys can count to Spanish, I'll bet, can't you, in 10? Can you count to 10 in Spanish? Uno, dos, tres. You can do that probably. I'm going to show you how to count in the Algoruna dialect. Now, they hold a doubled fist up. You got a fist? Hold your fist. Take a finger and bring it down, and you say, "Maki-cheek." That's 1. Maki-cheek. Himang. Kampatum. Ipatsumat. Uihamwa. That's 5. Now to say 6, you have to use the other hand. Uihamwa maki-chiki hook. Uihamwa himan-chiki hook. Uihama kampatam chiki hook. Uihama ipatsumari hook. My uihamwa. You got it? Now count to 10 for me. If you want to count to 11, then you have to use dawung. And it's my uihamwa dawung makichiki hook. Isn't that easy? And into a culture so very different than ours, friends. Wow, our first weeks in the jungle. Bamboo huts, thatch leaf roofs, dogs skinny that were used for hunting. Men that would go out with their blowguns and shoot birds and monkeys. They invited me one dinner. Wow. Special honored guest. They put us to the front of the line. They were so excited to have us for that meal. And the cook brought out this big pot of boiled manioc, yuca. That's a staple of your diet 3 times a day the rest of your life. And a big pot of boiled green bananas. And a huge pot of boiling soup. What would be, oh, I'll bet it's armadillo. Have you ever eaten armadillo? It's one of my favorite meats, white, tender, tastes a lot like chicken. Or would it be deer? We have beautiful deer meat there in the jungle. They eat lovely vegetation. It's very tasty. Or would it be anuhe or mahas, some of the rodent animals? But he took this big spoon and he began to stir the soup around this stick he had in his hand. And up floated to the top of that soup this round, dark object. It rolled over and we looked into the open eyes of a huge howler monkey's head. The tongue was hanging out. The ears were intact. Some of the hair hadn't been singed from the face. And he shoved that head down into the bottom of the pot, came up with the lower leg bone, the foot, and the toes, and flipped it into my wife's bowl. And I thought she would lose it. And up floated that head again and rolled over and looked at us, those dark, steely eyes staring straight ahead. And he shoved that head down again and fished around, came up with the forearm, the hand, the fingers, and the hair still on the knuckles, flopped that into my bowl, the fingers hanging over the side. And that was our first exposure to monkey, but not the last. But we were glad because only the hunter gets the head. Thank the Lord. So into a culture so vastly different, into a world so unfamiliar to us, to understand the culture and the customs, people who were bound by superstitions, enslaved to witchcraft. It was a dark world that was so difficult to penetrate. There were no churches. Earlier missionaries had gone in but had become very ill and had to leave. So the work had dissipated. There were no churches. We had one little tiny church, dirt floor, backless benches, railings that high. On Sunday morning, they would come from 3 different villages. They would fill out our church, 250 people sometimes. Men would come in with their skirts. I'd never seen men with skirts on before. We call them etipak. It's made out of a cloth material, and they wrap it around. It looks just like a skirt. And the men would have on their beautiful crown of parrot feathers. They dressed up for Sunday. Paint their face with a chote red seed paste. The men would have on their ears beautiful iridescent beetle-winged earrings. Only men wore earrings. And we came home and found it caught on. The men had long black hair hanging down over broad shoulders, tied in a ponytail with feathers in the back. The incredible sight on a Sunday morning. Some of them would come with their dancing bracelets around their ankles. They would drink their native beer called Masato. And they would dance to the beating of the drum with their spear in their hand. Hey, hey! And you could hear that in the wee hours of the night. A culture so vastly different. And when they heard that a doctor came, they came out of the woodwork. For the average life expectancy of the native population was only 42 years old. Parasitic problems, pneumonias, skin problems. Our people died at early age, a lot of revenge killings. And so it was a culture so challenging to find a way to reach them. I'll never forget that day. I was in the clinic, and I looked out the screen window, and I saw this dugout canoe pulling into our port. I watched these 2 men carry an individual wrapped in a ragged blanket up the hillside. They looked around. I could tell that they were unfamiliar with what they were seeing. Our home was not a thatched roof bamboo building. They had been told to come to our mission station for the individual that they were carrying. I made my way down to where they were. I looked at the men. They had on pants that were high-watered, threadbare, and patched. They had no shoes, of course. Their feet were calloused from endless trails. Their shirt was the same ragged material. They had the long, typical black hair hanging down over their shoulders, tattoo marks on their prominent cheekbone. And I looked at the blanket, and I noticed it was a lady. I said, "What has happened?" The man said, "We have crossed the trail for hours carrying my wife. She has had hemorrhage for 9 days. She couldn't even lift her head off the mat." I ushered them into our clinic. I could tell that they were taken by this. As they walked into the clinic, it was so unfamiliar. The things that they saw, the bottles of plasma hanging there, and IV equipment, and this was a strange. They'd never been in a clinic in their life. Had never seen a doctor. No clue what this bordered on superstition for them. And we put her on the examining table. Her blood pressure was dropping out the bottom. Her life was hanging by a mere thread. She had had hemorrhage 9 days. She was almost bled out. She was in desperate straits. She needed whole blood, but I didn't have any. The only thing that I had was plasma, which would help build the volume of the blood, but would certainly not recuperate her blood loss. But it would at least give her a little help. I thought she would probably not live. She could not even open her mouth. And so I hooked up the intravenous equipment. I put the tourniquet on her arm. Her husband stood on one side of the table, and he looked at me with this strange look. This is so difficult for him to understand. He had never seen anything like this in his life. And I wiped off her forearm with alcohol, and I was ready to plunge a 20-gauge needle into her arm when he stopped me. And he said, "But won't this kill her?" And I knew it was what was running through his mind. For in their culture, witchcraft is so prevalent. And if the witch doctor does not treat the patient well and that individual dies, he's held accountable, and many witch doctors have lost their lives. And I knew what was running through his mind. Do I take the chance? If she dies, which she probably will, I will be held accountable. What would my wife and my children, small children, do? How would they get out of the jungle? We had no way of communicating except by ham radio. And I stood frozen on that stage that day. What do I do? Do I take a chance? And then my mind went back to that night in California where God called. And when he calls, he never fails. And I tried to make that challenging decision. We were so isolated. No help could come in to get my wife and family for several days, even after communicating by ham radio. We were that isolated. And I stood holding that 20-gauge needle in my hand, and two cultures facing each other on opposite sides of that table. His culture had taught him all the do's and don'ts of life. And I on the other side, wanting to bring them life. And I stood frozen in that moment. What do I do? And then I thought about the first missionary that came to Peru back in 1914. Roger Winans and his wife Mary and their one-year-old son. Roger Winans went to the sandhills of Kansas to ask God for his will in his life. He prayed the first day, no answer. The second day, no answer. The third day in the afternoon, God pointed out to him a tribal group of people in the upper Amazon of Peru, no name attached to them. But he knew that's where he needed to go. He went to the World Mission Department in 1913. He said, God's calling me to Peru. And they said, we have no work that far south and probably never will. No money available back in 1913. He worked in the fields and raised the money for he and his wife and little boy. And finally they had enough to buy a third-class passage on a steamship leaving Los Angeles. 3 weeks later, landed on the coast of Peru. Stepped off of that boat, didn't know a soul. No contacts. They took lodging in a quote hotel that night, and the next morning did not have the money to pay the bill. Would you call that faith, or would you want to put another adjective on it? Yeah. He walked the streets of that little town. He said, God, we're here. What do we do? We have no money, we're nowhere to stay, nothing to eat. He ran across a couple young men that wanted to learn English. Those men took him to their employer, who advanced him enough money to rent a room for a month and buy a few groceries. 3 years later, the Church of the Nazarene picked them up as missionaries. That's the call of God. That's commitment. That's putting your all on the line. And I stood there that day thinking about Roger Winans and his wife Mary, who was willing to give everything they had. And hesitantly, I plunged the needle into the vein. I opened up the cock on the top of the plasma bottle, and plasma began to drip through into that line. And those two cultures stood facing each other. What would the outcome be? What would happen? Her life was hanging by a mere thread. I did everything I could to help her. And we waited. And finally that bottle ran dry. And there was no stir. She lay there silently, white as a sheet. And then she opened her mouth and she asked for some water. Her husband quickly brought a gourd full of water and placed to those dry, parched lips of hers, and she partook of that life-giving liquid. And a few moments later, she opened her eyes, and the rest became history. God answered prayer. And it was not the beginning of the new missionary's career. It was not the end, it was the beginning. And my wife helped them with feeding them. And a few weeks later, we watched them as we prayed with them every night in that little clinic, isolated by time. We watched them as they helped her walk down to that canoe. And I watched that canoe make its way up the river. And I knew we had won a battle. The doors had been opened, and God began to work. And the stories about people are incredible. 2 weeks ago, my wife and I were in Peru celebrating the Church of the Nazarene in the Amazon alone. 3,000 Nazarenes. Indians came from everywhere. I stood there that day absolutely amazed as they came with the little banners and walked 4 miles down to the port. And there a great meeting of 3,000 people gathered. I looked in the faces of many of those people and I remembered he was a drunkard. Oh my. I remember he beat his wife big time. Now he's on the church board in the village of Chipe. And on it went. The transforming grace of Jesus Christ. He went into a culture that was steeped in heathenism and brought them to a knowledge of himself. And today in that area there are 3 districts now of just the Indian people. Over 225 churches. Thanks be to the Lord. He is faithful. Thank you for supporting Nazarene missions across the years. Thank you for filling those alabaster boxes. Thank you for giving. Thank you for praying. How many have been on a work and witness team perhaps? Yes, wonderful. Thank you for changed our world forever. Can you imagine 200 work and witness teams came to the Amazon? My wife passed away over 4 years ago. And a year ago I married this beautiful lady here. She came to Iquitos, Peru, a jungle city where there are no roads into it. She came 44 years ago on the first team to build the first church in that city, and there that expanded now into a district. Thank the Lord for work and witness. Thanks for your involvement. Thanks for giving yourselves to those precious people. Can you imagine what it did for our people? When you wrapped your arms around their children and hugged them, when you slept on their bamboo beds, when you ate at their tables, whatever they offered you, when you helped drive nails in their building with them, it changed their world forever. They were looked down upon by their counterparts out on the coast. They were considered heathen, savage, uneducated. But when North Americans came, it changed them forever. Thank you for involving yourselves in missions. I'm here tonight to give you, from the bottom of my heart, the thanks. Could I tell you one more story? You see, it's all stories about people. People coming to the Lord, that's what it's all about, is it not? I was in the clinic again. You see, they lined up for days in a clinic. We had our one little church there, and people came from 3 different villages, sometimes from a 4th village called Numpatkim. You know where Numpatkim's located? It's down from Duship and above Chipe, give you an idea where it's located. And they would fill out a little church, and we were so excited. Every Sunday we had 250 people there, and it would blow your mind. They're standing outside, ladies sitting on leaves under the banana plants, and the beauty of the jungle all around you, the river, the Marañón River, and the Kusu that emptied into it. Gorgeous sight. But then we realized, wow, there are a lot of villages that don't have a church. There are just a lot of villages where there's no presence. How in the world are we going to... I'm a layman. I'm not a preacher. I've done my fair share of preaching. But I'm a layman. What in the world can a layman do? We were sent to work with another missionary who was a preacher. We got to Peru the same time they did, and they had to go home with a problem. And we went in by ourselves. I was going to do clinic work, and now the church, oh my word. And all these villages around us, how were we going to? Oh, I got an idea. You know what we did? We packed up our clinical supplies, all of our dental equipment, and we would take off we had a dugout canoe with sides on it and a 35 Evinrude motor in the back. And with my family, we would go downriver to a village where they didn't know us, they'd heard about us. And I would ask the head man, could we have a service? Let me have a service, and I'll treat all your sick people. Oh, they like that. So we would have a service, and people gather around this big communal hut, and my wife would teach a few courses, and I'd preach a sermon the best I could, and we had a great time, and then they'd line up for hours. Have a bench out under the shade tree. I'd give injections and pull teeth, and my kids were pounding pills, and it was a mess. Hours of treating people. Have another service that night. Next morning, another service early, and another line of patients. But you know what? A couple people got saved in those services. And then we went to the next village, and we'd go to village after village for 2 weeks like that. And then we would repeat that process later on. And those ones that got saved in those village times, we put them in charge. Hey, some of them couldn't even read. You're going to pastor this church now. I'd be shot today. And they would give their testimony, they'd get together, they'd sing a few songs that had been taught and worked and what best they could, and God began to work. And then we had a Bible school class for 1 week. We invited all the villages where we'd been to send somebody. 50 men came. We had a week Bible study. And we taught those guys, you go back and pastor that church. And they did the best they could. And then that evolved into a month course. And then a 3-month course. And then a Bible Institute. And the first thing you know, God was helping us prepare pastors. Isn't it wonderful how God has a plan? Well, it was a challenge for us. You see, into a culture so steeped in witchcraft and superstitions. I remember being in the clinic that day, and I saw this canoe pulling into our port. Canoes are always pulling into our port, coming from different directions. Some would come by trail. And I watched this man carry this little boy in his arms, hurriedly up to the clinic. I opened the door and ushered them in, and I looked at the little boy, and right away I knew that he had intestinal parasites, protruding abdomen. He was pale, hair loss. The child was malnourished. And after examining him, I gave the father the medicine. I said, now give this to your son. He will be okay. Give him the treatment for 3 days. Bring him back to me, and I will check him out. And as they left the clinic, they got into their canoe, but they did not go the direction to where they lived. They went up the other river, and I asked my helper, I said, Moses, they don't live up that river. Where are they going? He said, well, they're going to visit the witch doctor tonight. But they've just been here. Oh, he said, most people come here and then go to the witch doctor. Well, thanks a lot. And I want to go to the witch doctor tonight. I want to see how they work. He said, well, we can do it. We'll have to go after dark because the witch doctor only works at night. During the daytime, he takes hallucinating drugs called ayahuasca, made from an extract of a certain vine, so that they will have visions to heal the individual they're going to treat. And it was a beautiful sunny day, you know, and I said, well, let's go tonight. So the day wore on, and we bathed in the river and had our evening supper there, and I cranked up the old generator to give us a little bit of light in the house. And it was a lovely evening and dark outside, and you could hear the sounds of the jungle at night. You know, it's different. And I'd forgot all about going to the witch doctor, and I saw a flashlight coming towards our house. Oh, no, he remembered. And Moses came up to the door. He said, Doctor, I'm ready. Let's go. I said, no, let's don't do this tonight. Let's do this another time. They don't know we're coming. They might not like us just coming in and announce. Oh, he said, no, I got the boat ready. Let's go. Oh, man. I grabbed my flashlight, told my family goodbye, walked out into the dark night, got into our little boat, and we began to paddle up the quiet waters of the Coosa River, staying close to the shore. You can hear the night sounds, the predator animals looking for their prey in the canopy overhead. A cool, light breeze. Water would drip from the oar, splashing into the water under our dry skin. It was an eerie feeling as we made our way slowly up the Coosa River. Around each bend we made our way, and finally we saw a nest of canoes tied to the bank. He said, wow, there's a large crowd at the witch doctor tonight. I said, yes, there sure is. And I said, let's go home. They don't know we're coming. They won't like us just intruding. Let's go back. He said, no. He jumped out, tied up the boat, and he took off down the trail. I wasn't about to stay there by myself. So I jumped out of the boat and plodded along behind him. The witch doctor can't live close to the river. He's got to live way back in where it terrifies you. And we're walking through this thin-cut trail, and my flashlight doing 360 because we have snakes there in the jungle. If you're welcome to look at these, I brought some fangs of poisonous snakes we have. We have the large bushmaster. They get up to 12 feet in length. Deadly snake. I've treated people from that bite. It's nasty. We have the little boash, we call it, about that long. You can't see him, camouflaged into the ground. He's an ankle biter. And I was looking for any snake around, of course. And then I could hear off in the distance, hey, 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 hey. And the hair stood up on the back of my neck and my arms. I could hear the chanting of the witch doctor way off in the jungle. And we kept plodding along, walking that trail. And finally we could see the dim light, yellowish little light coming through the bamboo poles of that hut. Could see the thatched roof there under a darkened sky. And I could hear the chanting of the witch doctor, hey, hey, hey. And we stopped, and my helper called out, Yatsuhu Chimpa Puhamak. Friend Chimpa, the witch doctor, are you there? He replied back, Yatsuhu Puhahe, yes, I'm here. Yay, Po, who's there? It's Moses and the doctor. Ayu Wayata Kumsata, he said. Come in, sit down. We made our way through that doorway made of posts. I sat on the edge of a bed, my eyes adjusting to the dim-lit hut that night. And I saw the little boy that I'd treated early that day. He was lying on a banana leaf there in the middle of the floor, kind of in a transfixed state. The boy was not moving, and the witch doctor was making sounds over his abdomen, trying to extract the boy's disease. And there was another witch doctor sitting behind him who was chanting, you are all powerful, you can heal this boy. And I'm absorbed into this scene. And there was the grandfather off to the side preparing tobacco in the fire. Tobacco leaves. And the other witch doctor was chanting, you can heal him, you can heal him. And the family standing off in the shadows were waiting, anxiously awaiting. And finally the witch doctor, he rose up and spit out to one side the disease that was causing the boy's sickness. And the family was relieved, and the grandfather brought the tobacco leaves over, and the witch doctor purified his mouth so he would not be contaminated. Into that world we found ourselves. How do you reach a people like that? How do you bring them to the Lord? We excused ourselves a few moments later. I walked down that trail back into the boat, and I was so discouraged as a new young missionary. I was beside myself. How do you bring the gospel to them? How do you break through these cultural issues? And as we got into the boat and slowly made our way back down the stream, I looked and I could see the little light of our home. And I so desperately wanted to crawl into that house and erase the memories of those last moments. I wanted to forget that scene that I had seen that so devastated me. The confidence they didn't have in my treatment. And as the boat was docking, my mind went to a grave. Roger Winans, his wife, Esther Carson, they went into the edge of that jungle and began to preach to those people way back in 1924. But when they left, the work dissipated. And after giving childbirth at the age of 37, deep in the jungles, 2 weeks from any help, Esther Carson Winans died giving birth to a little girl. And I remembered as a young missionary kneeling at that gravesite, and I made a promise to the Lord, Lord, whatever it takes, help us. Help us to reach these people. And as our boat struck the shore, I said, Lord, we're willing. If you will build your church, we'll stay. And he has built his church. And I wish you could have been there 2 weeks ago. 3,000 people, Indians singing the praises of the Lord. Amen. Because you prayed. You gave. You made it happen. Thank you for supporting Nazarene missionaries. May God wonderfully bless you as together we build the church around the world. Thank you.